A day dawning on Jerusalem morning.
The call to prayer rising from the stone streets mingles with church bells. In this city thousands of years old, in October 1949, a child is born.
His name, Benjamin Netanyahu.
He will be remembered in the future, both with admiration and with hatred. But there's one thing everyone agrees on: he will become one of the most powerful leaders in Israeli history. Benjamin, or Bibi as his family called him, was born in the heart of Jerusalem. His father, Benjamin Netanyahu, was a world-renowned historian. He was one of the intellectual fathers of the Zionist movement. So even when Benjamin was a child, the concept called Israel's destiny was a topic discussed in his home.
Little Benjamin's childhood didn't last very long. His family moved to America when he was still a young child. There, he encountered a different world, modern, free, but also a world that made him question his identity. His mother, Sayeret Netanyahu, was a quiet but strong woman.
She constantly told her children, "Never forget who you are."
This phrase would guide Bibi's entire life. He was successful at school but introverted.
His brothers Yonatan and Iddo were his closest friends.
Especially Yonatan was his hero. Brave, idealistic, and determined.
In Bibi's eyes, he was more than a brother. This is the story of a man who rose from the stone streets of Jerusalem to become one of the most controversial leaders of our time. A man who shaped a nation's fate. A man who divided opinions like few others in history. Today, we're going to explore the life of Benjamin Netanyahu. From his childhood in Jerusalem to the corridors of power. From military hero to political giant.
From defender to accused. Is he a visionary leader who protected his nation? Or a divisive figure who sacrificed peace for power? Let's discover together. Jerusalem, 1949.
A city where three religions intersect. Where every stone carries a story. Where the past and future collide every day.
Into this city, Benjamin Netanyahu was born. But his story doesn't begin here.
It begins with his father.
Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't just a historian.
He was a man with a mission.
He believed that the Jewish people needed a homeland to survive.
He dedicated his life to this cause. The Netanyahu home was different from other homes.
While other families talked about daily life at dinner, they discussed history, politics, and survival at the Netanyahu table.
Young Benjamin listened to these conversations.
He absorbed every word. His father would tell him, "Benjamin, we're not just a family. We're part of something bigger.
We carry the responsibility of thousands of years."
This responsibility weighed heavily on small shoulders. But Benjamin never complained. He was proud. When Benjamin was still young, the family made a big decision: they would move to America. Benjamin had received an academic position. This was a great opportunity. But for young Benjamin, it was traumatic. He had to leave Jerusalem, the city he loved. He had to leave his friends, his neighborhood, the streets he knew. America was different. Very different. In Jerusalem, everyone knew who they were.
Everyone had a story, a heritage, an identity. But in America, especially in the suburbs of Philadelphia where they settled, things were more complicated.
Benjamin had to learn a new language. Adapt to a new culture. Make new friends.
But he never forgot where he came from. His mother Sila made sure of that. She constantly reminded her children, "You're Israelis.
Don't ever forget that." Benjamin was a good student. He was especially strong in mathematics and sciences. But he was quiet. He didn't talk much. His classmates saw him as different. Some thought he was arrogant. Others thought he was just shy. The truth was somewhere in between. Benjamin was observing. Learning. Calculating. Even then, he was thinking strategically.
His brothers were his world.
Especially Yonatan. Yonatan was everything Benjamin wanted to be. Bold, confident, charismatic. A natural leader.
The two brothers had a special bond.
They would spend hours discussing everything: politics, philosophy, the future of Israel. Their dreams. Yonatan would say, "One day, we'll return to Israel.
And we'll serve our country."
Benjamin would nod silently. But deep inside, a fire was burning. A determination was forming. As Benjamin grew older, his connection to Israel grew stronger. He read everything he could about Israeli history. About the wars. About the heroes. About the struggles.
He particularly admired military leaders.
Men like Moshe Dayan.
Men who protected their nation with strength and courage. But he also understood something else: Israel wasn't just about military power.
It was about survival.
About making impossible choices in an impossible situation.
This understanding would shape his entire worldview.
When Benjamin turned 17, he made a decision.
He told his parents, "I want to go back to Israel. I want to serve in the army."
His father wasn't surprised. He had raised his sons to love Israel,
to be ready to sacrifice for it.
His mother was worried. But she was also proud.
She knew her son was making the right choice.
And so, in 1967, Benjamin Netanyahu returned to Israel.
Not as a tourist. Not as a visitor. But as a soldier.
When Benjamin Netanyahu stepped off the plane in Israel in 1967, he was 18 years old. Young, determined, and ready to prove himself.
Israel was a country constantly under threat. Surrounded by enemies. Always on alert.
This wasn't a normal military service.
This was about survival. Benjamin didn't want to be just any soldier. He wanted to be the best. So he applied to join one of the most elite units in the Israeli Defense Forces, Sayeret Matkal. Sayeret Matkal isn't just a military unit. It's a legend. The Israeli equivalent of the British SAS or American Delta Force. Only the best of the best make it through. The selection process was brutal. Physical tests that pushed candidates to their limits. Psychological evaluations that broke many. Only a tiny percentage succeeded. Benjamin was one of them.
The training was intense. They learned urban warfare, counterterrorism, intelligence gathering, and covert operations. They were trained to think fast, act faster, and never hesitate.
But more than the physical training, what shaped Benjamin was the mentality.
In Sayeret Matkal, they learned one simple principle: failure is not an option.
This principle would stay with Benjamin for the rest of his life.
In Sayeret Matkal, Benjamin participated in numerous operations.
Many were classified. Some remain secret to this day. But we know some things. We know he was brave. We know he was effective. We know he earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. One particular operation stands out.
In 1972, Sayeret Matkal was called to respond to a hijacking. A Sabina Airlines flight had been hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and forced to land at Israel's Lot Airport.
The hostages were in danger. Time was running out. A decision had to be made. Sayeret Matkal was ordered to storm the plane. Benjamin Netanyahu was part of that team. The operation was successful. The hostages were saved.
The terrorists were neutralized.
But it came at a cost.
Several soldiers were wounded. Benjamin himself was shot in the shoulder.
But he didn't stop. He continued the mission until it was complete.
This was Benjamin Netanyahu, focused, determined, and willing to take a bullet for his mission.
October 6, 1973. Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Israel was at prayer. The country was quiet. And then, without warning, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack. It was Israel's darkest hour. The country was caught completely off guard. The army scrambled to respond. Thousands of soldiers rushed to the fronts. Benjamin Netanyahu was among them. The Yom Kippur War was unlike anything Israel had experienced. The losses were catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers died. The country came close to collapse. Netanyahu fought on the Suez Canal front. He saw death up close. Friends died in his arms. He witnessed the horror of war in its rawest form. One particular moment stayed with him forever. His unit was pinned down under heavy fire. They were outnumbered and outgunned. It seemed hopeless. But Netanyahu didn't panic. He organized his men, found a way out, led them to safety. That day, he learned something crucial: in the darkest moments, leadership matters most. The war eventually turned. Israel pushed back the attackers. But the victory was bitter. The cost was too high. And the entire nation was traumatized. After the Yom Kippur War, Israel went through a period of deep soul-searching. How had they been caught so unprepared? Who was responsible? What had gone wrong? The government faced massive criticism. The military leadership was blamed. Protests erupted across the country. Benjamin Netanyahu watched all this carefully. And he came to a conclusion: strong leadership isn't just about military power. It's about foresight. About preparation. About never letting your guard down. He also realized something else: Israel would always be vulnerable. Always under threat. Always needing to be stronger, smarter, and more vigilant than its enemies. This realization would shape his entire political philosophy. And then came the event that would change Benjamin's life forever. On June 27, 1976, an Air France plane was hijacked by Palestinian and German terrorists. The plane was diverted to Entebbe, Uganda, where the Jewish passengers were separated and held hostage. The situation seemed impossible. Uganda was thousands of miles away. The hostages were heavily guarded. Any rescue attempt would be incredibly risky. But Israel decided to try anyway. A daring raid was planned. The best soldiers were chosen. And leading the operation was Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, Benjamin's brother. His hero. The operation was launched on July 4. Israeli commandos flew all the way to Uganda, stormed the airport, and rescued the hostages. It was one of the most daring military operations in history. A stunning success. But there was one casualty among the Israeli forces: Yonatan Netanyahu was killed by a Ugandan sniper. When Benjamin heard the news, his world collapsed. Yonatan wasn't just his brother. He was his inspiration. His role model. His best friend. The entire nation mourned. Yonatan became a national hero. Streets and schools were named after him. He was seen as the ultimate symbol of Israeli courage and sacrifice. But for Benjamin, it was personal. Deeply, devastatingly personal. At the funeral, Benjamin stood silent. He didn't cry publicly. But inside, something fundamental changed. He later said, "When Yonatan died, I realized that leadership comes with the ultimate price. And someone has to be willing to pay it." That day, Benjamin Netanyahu decided his path. He would dedicate his life to ensuring that his brother's sacrifice wasn't in vain. He would fight for Israel's security. For its survival. For its future. No matter the cost. After completing his military service and dealing with the trauma of losing Yonatan, Benjamin Netanyahu faced a choice. He could continue in the military. Many expected him to.
With his record and his brother's legacy, he could have had a distinguished military career.
But Benjamin had other plans.
He returned to America to continue his education.
But this wasn't an escape. This was preparation. In 1975, Benjamin enrolled at MIT to study architecture.
It seemed like an unusual choice for someone with his background.
But for Netanyahu, everything was strategic.
Architecture taught him about structure, design, and planning.
Skills he would later apply to politics and nation building.
But more importantly, MIT exposed him to American culture at its finest.
He made connections, built networks,
learned how Americans thought.
After MIT, he moved to Harvard to study management.
Then he took courses in political science.
He was building a diverse skill set,
preparing himself for something bigger. His academic performance was solid, but what really stood out was his presence.
He was charismatic, articulate, confident. Professors noticed. Fellow students noticed.
He wasn't just another graduate student.
There was something different about him.
During these years, Benjamin mastered something crucial, the art of communication. He studied how to speak persuasively,
how to structure arguments, how to connect with audiences.
He watched American politicians, analyzed their speeches,
learned their techniques.
But he added his own touch.
Unlike many politicians who tried to be warm and friendly, Netanyahu projected strength and authority. He didn't smile much. He didn't joke. He was serious, focused, and intense. This style would become his trademark.
He also perfected his English. Not just functional English, but powerful, eloquent English.
With no accent.
With perfect diction.
Like a native speaker. This would prove invaluable later. In the early 1980s, Netanyahu joined Israel's diplomatic corps. He was assigned to the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C.
This was a critical period. The Middle East was in turmoil. The Lebanon War had just started.
Israel was facing international criticism.
The narrative was turning against them.
And then Benjamin Netanyahu appeared on American television. American audiences had never seen anyone quite like Netanyahu. Here was an Israeli diplomat who looked like a TV anchor,
who spoke perfect English,
who could debate circles around journalists. He appeared on shows like Nightline, Meet the Press, and CNN.
And every time, he dominated. He had a simple strategy: never apologize.
Never be defensive. Always be on offense. Frame the narrative. Control the message. When journalists asked tough questions about Israeli actions, Netanyahu didn't fumble. He pivoted.
He reframed. He turned the question back on them. Why do you ask about Israeli security measures but never about the terrorism targeting Israeli civilians? He would say.
It was effective. Devastatingly effective. American viewers were impressed. Here was someone articulate, passionate, and unapologetic about defending his country. The Israeli government took notice.
Netanyahu was given more prominent roles,
more airtime, more responsibility. He became Israel's face to America.
In 1984, Netanyahu was appointed as Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations.
This was a major promotion. And a major challenge.
The UN was, and still is, a difficult arena for Israel. Many member states were hostile.
Resolutions condemning Israel were routine. Israel often felt isolated and outnumbered. Netanyahu's job was to change that. Or at least to fight back effectively. And he did. With characteristic intensity. In one famous speech, a Palestinian representative spoke at length about Palestinian suffering.
When Netanyahu's turn came, he pulled out a book.
"This is the UN Charter," he said, holding it up.
Then he opened it. Page after page had been torn out.
"You see? Just like you've torn out the parts about Israel's right to exist. Just like you ignore Israel's security concerns. Just like you apply double standards." It was theatrical. Dramatic. And it worked. The speech went viral before going viral was even a term. Netanyahu had mastered the art of political theater.
1. Strength is the only language understood in the Middle East.
Weakness invites aggression. Compromise is seen as surrender. Israel must always negotiate from a position of strength. 2. International opinion matters, but survival matters more.
Israel should care about its image, but never at the expense of security.
Popularity is temporary. Survival is permanent. 3. The world will never fully understand Israel's situation.
Only Israelis, living under constant threat, can truly comprehend the choices they face. Outsiders will always judge from comfortable distance. 4. Leadership requires making unpopular decisions. Sometimes the right choice isn't the popular choice. True leaders must be willing to be hated if it means protecting their people. These principles would guide Netanyahu throughout his political career. They would make him loved by some and despised by others. But they would never change.
By 1988, Netanyahu had spent years in America. He had built an impressive resume.
He had connections in Washington.
He had media experience. He had name recognition.
Now it was time to return home and enter politics directly.
When he arrived back in Israel, people were curious. Here was this polished, American-style political figure. How would he fit into Israeli politics? The answer came quickly, perfectly. Benjamin Netanyahu officially entered Israeli politics by joining the Likud party. Likud was the right-wing party, founded by Menachem Begin.
It stood for strong security, free market economics, and a tough stance on negotiations with Palestinians. It was a natural fit for Netanyahu.
But joining a party is one thing.
Rising within it is another.
Israeli politics is brutal. Personal rivalries are fierce. Ambition is naked. Betrayals are common.
Netanyahu navigated this jungle with skill. He formed alliances,
made promises, collected debts,
and most importantly, he built a public profile. While other politicians relied on party machines, Netanyahu went directly to the people through media.
He gave interviews constantly. He appeared on TV shows. He wrote op-eds.
And his message was consistent: Israel needs strong leadership.
The peace process is important, but security comes first. We can't trust our enemies to keep their word. This message resonated, especially with Israelis who were skeptical of the Oslo peace process that was beginning to take shape.
In 1993, something historic happened.
Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords.
For the first time, Israel officially recognized the PLO, and the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn.
President Bill Clinton beamed between them.
The world celebrated.
But not everyone in Israel was celebrating.
And Netanyahu was the loudest voice of skepticism.
"This is a terrible mistake," he declared. "We're giving up tangible security for empty promises. We're arming our enemies and calling it peace."
His critics called him a warmonger,
a fearmonger, someone who couldn't imagine peace. But Netanyahu was unmoved.
"I want peace as much as anyone," he said. "But I won't sacrifice Israel's security for a piece of paper."
Netanyahu's opposition to Oslo made him a hero to the Israeli right.
They saw him as their champion. The one brave enough to say what they were thinking.
In 1993, Likud chose Netanyahu as its leader. He was only 43 years old.
But he had already proven himself as a fighter, a communicator, and a strategist. Now he set his sights on the ultimate prize, Prime Minister. The next 3 years were intense. Netanyahu built his campaign. He refined his message. He prepared for the biggest fight of his life.
And then, tragedy struck in a way that would change everything. November 4, 1995.
Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin had just finished speaking at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. As he walked to his car, a young right-wing extremist named Yigal Amir stepped forward and shot him. Rabin died later that night.
Israel was in shock. The nation mourned.
And many blamed the harsh rhetoric against the Oslo Accords for creating the atmosphere that led to the assassination. Netanyahu was accused of inflaming tensions,
of demonizing Rabin,
of contributing to a climate of hate.
He denied it. But the damage was done.
Many Israelis saw him as partly responsible. It should have ended his political career.
But something unexpected happened.
In the months after Rabin's death, Shimon Peres became prime minister.
Elections were scheduled for 1996. Peres was expected to win easily. He was the elder statesman. He had Rabin's legacy behind him. He represented peace and hope. Netanyahu, by contrast, represented strength and skepticism.
The campaign was brutal,
personal, nasty. But then came a series of suicide bombings. Hamas terrorists struck buses and cafes in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Dozens of Israelis died. Fear gripped the nation. And suddenly, Netanyahu's message resonated: do you feel safer than you did 4 years ago? Has the peace process made you more secure or less secure? The polls shifted. Security trumped peace. Fear trumped hope.
On May 29, 1996, in one of the closest elections in Israeli history, Benjamin Netanyahu defeated Shimon Peres by less than 1 percentage point. At 46 years old, he became the youngest prime minister in Israeli history.
Netanyahu's first term began with enormous expectations from his supporters and enormous hostility from his opponents. He had promised strong security, economic growth,
and no dangerous concessions to the Palestinians. But reality is always more complicated than campaign promises.
Netanyahu faced immediate challenges.
The international community expected him to continue the peace process.
The Americans, especially President Clinton, pressured him to make deals. The Palestinians expected concessions.
The Israeli left protested constantly.
The media was hostile.
And within his own coalition, there were tensions. Israeli governments are always coalitions, and managing coalition partners is like herding cats.
Despite his rhetoric, Netanyahu did negotiate with the Palestinians.
In January 1997, he signed the Hebron Agreement, which withdrew Israeli forces from most of the city of Hebron. His right-wing supporters felt betrayed.
"You promised no concessions," they shouted. His left-wing critics said it wasn't enough.
"You're sabotaging the peace process," they accused. Netanyahu was caught in the classic Israeli prime minister trap: everyone hates you.
The right thinks you're too soft. The left thinks you're too hard. No one is satisfied. But he defended his approach: I'm doing what's necessary for Israel's security while maintaining international support. It's a tightrope walk, and it's not easy. One area where Netanyahu felt more comfortable was economics. Unlike security, which required constant compromise, economics was something he could control.
He pushed for privatization.
He reduced government spending. He encouraged foreign investment.
He supported the growing tech sector.
Israel's economy grew.
The startup nation concept began to take shape.
Tel Aviv started transforming into a tech hub.
His supporters celebrated.
But critics pointed out that his policies also increased inequality.
The rich got richer. The poor struggled.
Netanyahu's response: a rising tide lifts all boats. Economic growth benefits everyone eventually. Not everyone agreed. Social tensions grew. By 1999, Netanyahu was in trouble. His coalition was fracturing.
His approval ratings were falling.
Scandals were emerging. The opposition was energized. And then came the election. In May 1999, Israelis went to the polls.
And they decisively rejected Netanyahu. Ehud Barak, the Labour Party candidate, won in a landslide.
Netanyahu's first term was over.
Many people thought his political career was finished. He was only 49 years old, but he seemed like yesterday's man.
Out of touch. Defeated. Irrelevant.
They were very, very wrong.
Benjamin Netanyahu had just suffered a humiliating defeat.
The man who had been the youngest prime minister was now a former prime minister.
A has-been.
He did what many defeated politicians do: he left the country. Netanyahu returned to the United States.
But he wasn't running away. He was regrouping. He took consulting jobs.
He gave speeches.
He made money.
He maintained connections.
And he waited. During this period, something important happened. Netanyahu wrote a book. It was called Fighting Terrorism: How Democracies Can Defeat Domestic and International Terrorists.
The book laid out his philosophy on terrorism. His argument was simple: terrorism works when democracies show weakness. The only way to defeat terrorism is through strength, deterrence, and refusing to negotiate under threat.
The book came out in 2001.
Just months before September 11th. When terrorists attacked America on September 11, 2001, the world changed.
Suddenly, America understood what Israel had been dealing with for decades. And suddenly, Netanyahu's message seemed prophetic.
His book became a bestseller.
He was invited to speak everywhere. News networks wanted his analysis. He became America's go-to expert on terrorism.
And his message was consistent: Israel has been fighting this battle for 50 years.
We know what works and what doesn't. Strength works. Appeasement doesn't. This rehabilitated his image internationally. He went from being seen as a hardliner to being seen as someone who understood the threat the Western world now faced. Meanwhile, back in Israel, things were deteriorating.
In 2000, the Second Intifada had begun.
Palestinian violence surged. Suicide bombings became regular occurrences.
Israelis were terrified. The Oslo peace process, which had promised so much, seemed to have delivered only violence.
And many Israelis remembered Netanyahu's warnings: they're not ready for peace.
They'll use any concessions to attack us. His predictions had come true.
And Israelis started thinking, maybe we need Bibi back.
In 2003, Ariel Sharon became prime minister.
He needed a strong economic hand to deal with Israel's struggling economy. He called Netanyahu. Come back. Be my finance minister. Netanyahu agreed. But on his terms. He demanded full control over economic policy. Sharon agreed. And so Netanyahu returned to government.
Not as prime minister, but as finance minister. It was a step down from his previous position, but he took it anyway. Because Netanyahu understood something important: sometimes you have to take a step back to take 2 steps forward. As finance minister, Netanyahu implemented radical reforms. He cut public spending dramatically. He reduced welfare benefits. He privatized government companies.
He reformed the tax system. Labor unions protested. The left was outraged. Thousands took to the streets. But Netanyahu was unmoved. These reforms are necessary.
The economy was collapsing.
We had no choice. And the results? Mixed. The economy did grow. GDP increased. Unemployment fell. Foreign investment rose. But inequality also increased. The poor got poorer. The middle class struggled. Social services were cut. Netanyahu's defenders say he saved the economy.
His critics say he sacrificed the poor for the rich.
Both are probably right.
In 2005, Prime Minister Sharon made a controversial decision: Israel would unilaterally withdraw from Gaza.
All settlements would be evacuated. All soldiers would leave. It was a huge gamble. Sharon believed it would improve Israel's security and international position.
Netanyahu strongly disagreed. He argued publicly against the plan.
He said it would turn Gaza into a terrorist base. He predicted Hamas would take over and use it to attack Israel. When Sharon refused to change course, Netanyahu resigned from the government in protest. "This is a historic mistake," he declared.
"We're giving our enemies a base to attack us from.
Mark my words, we will regret this." Many people dismissed his warnings.
They thought he was just being his usual hardline self.
But within 2 years, Hamas had taken over Gaza and started launching rockets at Israeli cities. Once again, Netanyahu's predictions had come true. And once again, Israelis started thinking, maybe Bibi was right all along.
The global financial crisis was in full swing.
Israel had just finished a war in Gaza. The country was looking for strong, experienced leadership. And who better than Netanyahu? In February 2009, elections were held. Netanyahu's Likud party did well. He formed a coalition.
And on March 31, 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu was sworn in as prime minister for the second time.
He was 59 years old. More experienced. More calculating. More determined than ever. And this time, he wouldn't let go of power easily. This wasn't the Netanyahu of 1996. That Netanyahu had been young, impulsive, sometimes reckless.
This Netanyahu was a master politician.
He knew how to manage coalitions, how to manipulate rivals, how to control the narrative.
He surrounded himself with loyal advisors.
He kept potential challengers off balance. He used media strategically. He played the long game. And it worked.
He would go on to become the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history.
One of Netanyahu's first challenges was dealing with the new American president, Barack Obama.
The relationship was difficult from the start.
Obama wanted to restart the peace process.
He pressured Israel to freeze settlement construction.
He reached out to the Muslim world. Netanyahu was skeptical. He saw Obama as naive about the Middle East, as too willing to pressure Israel and too soft on Iran.
The tension between them was palpable. At one White House meeting, Obama reportedly made Netanyahu wait while he went to have dinner with his family. It was a calculated slight,
a way of showing displeasure. But Netanyahu didn't back down. He continued building settlements. He resisted American pressure. He went over Obama's head, speaking directly to Congress and the American public. The relationship between the two men never recovered. For Netanyahu, the biggest threat wasn't Palestinian terrorism. It was Iran.
Iran was developing nuclear capabilities. Iran's leaders regularly threatened to destroy Israel.
Iran supported Hezbollah and Hamas.
Netanyahu became obsessed with stopping Iran's nuclear program. He made speech after speech warning about the danger. In 2012, he spoke at the UN General Assembly.
He held up a diagram of a bomb with a red line drawn on it. "This is a bomb," he said, his voice grave. "This is where Iran is in their nuclear program.
And this, pointing to the red line, is where they must not be allowed to go."
It was vintage Netanyahu, simple, visual, dramatic.
In 2015, the Obama administration negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran.
The agreement would lift sanctions in exchange for limits on Iran's nuclear program. Obama praised it as a historic achievement. European leaders supported it.
Even some Israelis thought it was better than nothing.
But Netanyahu was furious.
He called it a historic mistake. And then he did something unprecedented. He accepted an invitation from Republicans in Congress to speak against the deal without coordinating with the White House. On March 3, 2015, Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress.
The speech was broadcast live. Millions watched. "This deal doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb," he declared. "It paves Iran's path to the bomb." Democrats boycotted the speech.
The White House was livid.
Critics accused Netanyahu of interfering in American politics. But Netanyahu didn't care. "This isn't about politics," he said. "This is about survival."
The speech didn't stop the deal.
But it reinforced Netanyahu's image, a leader willing to stand alone if necessary.
A leader who put Israel's security above diplomatic niceties. While security dominated headlines, Netanyahu's government also presided over significant economic growth. Israel's tech sector exploded. Startups proliferated.
Major companies like Intel, Google, and Apple opened R&D centers in Israel. Unemployment fell to historic lows.
GDP grew steadily.
Israel joined the OECD.
The startup nation brand became real.
Israel became known as an innovation powerhouse. Netanyahu took credit for this success.
And to some extent, he deserved it.
His economic policies encouraged investment and entrepreneurship. But critics pointed out that not all Israelis benefited equally. Housing prices skyrocketed. The cost of living rose dramatically. Young Israelis struggled to afford apartments.
In 2011, massive social protests erupted.
Hundreds of thousands took to the streets demanding economic justice.
Netanyahu responded with some reforms, but largely dismissed the protesters. "The economy is strong," he said.
"Yes, there are challenges, but overall we're doing well." For many young Israelis, this response seemed tone-deaf. Throughout his tenure, Netanyahu continued to expand settlements in the West Bank.
This was extremely controversial. Palestinians saw settlements as stealing their land. The international community called them illegal.
Even American presidents asked Israel to stop. But Netanyahu kept building. His coalition depended on pro-settlement parties.
His base supported expansion. And he personally believed that Israel had the right to build on land it controlled.
"These are not settlements," he would say. "These are neighborhoods. Jewish communities.
We have as much right to live here as anyone." Critics accused him of making peace impossible.
"How can there be a two-state solution if you keep taking the land for the Palestinian state?"
Netanyahu's response: "There won't be a Palestinian state while I'm prime minister.
Not under current conditions. It's too dangerous." This wasn't what international diplomats wanted to hear.
But it was what Netanyahu believed.
By the mid-2010s, Netanyahu seemed untouchable.
He had been prime minister for years.
He dominated Israeli politics.
His coalition was stable.
But then, trouble started brewing. In 2016, Israeli police began investigating Netanyahu for corruption. Multiple cases. Multiple allegations. Case 1000, Netanyahu allegedly received expensive gifts from wealthy businessmen in exchange for political favors.
Case 2000, Netanyahu allegedly tried to make a deal with a newspaper owner for better coverage.
Case 4000, this was the big one.
Netanyahu allegedly helped a telecommunications company in exchange for positive coverage on their news website.
Netanyahu denied everything. "It's a witch hunt," he declared. "The left-wing establishment is trying to bring me down because they can't beat me at the ballot box."
His supporters believed him. They rallied around him. "Bibi or nothing" became their slogan.
His opponents were equally passionate.
They took to the streets every Saturday night. Thousands of protesters gathered outside the Prime Minister's residence, demanding his resignation.
"Prime Minister," they chanted. "Bibi to prison." Israel was deeply divided. Not just politically, but emotionally.
Families stopped speaking to each other.
Friendships ended. The country was at war with itself. But Netanyahu wouldn't budge. He refused to resign. He refused to step aside even temporarily. Instead, he fought. And then came Donald Trump.
In 2016, Trump was elected President of the United States.
For Netanyahu, this was a gift from heaven. Trump and Netanyahu had a warm relationship.
They saw the world similarly. They both loved to fight. They both distrusted the establishment.
They both used similar political tactics. And Trump gave Netanyahu everything he wanted.
In December 2017, Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the American embassy there.
This was something Israel had wanted for decades. Previous American presidents had promised it but never delivered. Trump delivered.
In 2019, Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, territory Israel had captured from Syria in 1967.
And most significantly, in 2020, Trump brokered the Abraham Accords.
The Abraham Accords were historic.
For the first time, Arab countries openly normalized relations with Israel without requiring a Palestinian state first. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco.
One by one, they signed peace agreements with Israel. This was Netanyahu's diplomatic triumph. For years, he had argued that peace with Palestinians wasn't necessary for peace with Arab states. That Arab countries cared more about Iranian threats than Palestinian rights. He was proven correct. The Abraham Accords transformed the Middle East.
Israeli tourists visited Dubai. Israeli companies opened offices in Abu Dhabi. Trade flourished. Netanyahu basked in the glory.
Finally, after all the criticism, all the accusations of being an obstacle to peace, he had delivered historic peace agreements. His supporters were vindicated. His critics grudgingly admitted it was significant.
For a moment, Netanyahu seemed invincible again. But then came the elections. Or rather, the elections. Plural.
Between April 2019 and March 2021, Israel held 4 elections in 2 years.
Why? Because Netanyahu couldn't form a stable coalition. And his opponents couldn't either. Israel was stuck in political gridlock. Each election ended inconclusively. Coalitions would form and then collapse. The country was exhausted. Netanyahu used every trick in his political playbook. He made deals. He broke deals. He promised things he couldn't deliver. He demonized opponents. He changed election laws. But nothing worked.
He remained prime minister, but in a caretaker capacity.
Unable to fully govern. Unable to pass a budget. Unable to move forward. It was political paralysis. And Israelis were sick of it. And then came COVID-19.
In March 2020, the coronavirus pandemic reached Israel.
Like everywhere else, the country went into lockdown. Netanyahu took charge. He appeared on TV every evening, updating the nation.
He imported vaccines early.
Israel became one of the first countries to vaccinate its population.
For a while, Netanyahu looked like a strong leader managing a crisis. His approval ratings rose. But then problems emerged. The economy struggled.
Small businesses closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. And Netanyahu's government seemed more focused on political survival than pandemic response. Protests resumed. Even during lockdowns, Israelis came out to demand Netanyahu's resignation.
The health crisis became a political crisis. The political crisis became a constitutional crisis.
In May 2020, Netanyahu's corruption trial began.
He became the first sitting Israeli prime minister to stand trial. He appeared in court, sitting in the defendant's chair.
It was a surreal moment. The most powerful man in Israel, accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Netanyahu called it a coup attempt. He said the justice system was biased against him. He claimed he was being persecuted for his political views. His supporters agreed. His opponents said no one is above the law. The trial would drag on for years. It's still ongoing as of today. June 2021. After 12 consecutive years in power, Benjamin Netanyahu's reign finally ended. A diverse coalition of parties, ranging from far right to far left, united around one goal: remove Netanyahu. They succeeded.
Naftali Bennett, a former Netanyahu ally, became prime minister of this unlikely coalition.
Netanyahu moved to the opposition.
For the first time in over a decade, he wasn't running the country.
Many people thought this was the end.
Netanyahu was 71 years old.
He was facing trial. He was out of power. Surely, he would fade away.
They didn't know Netanyahu.
Netanyahu didn't fade. He didn't retire quietly.
Instead, he became the most aggressive opposition leader in Israeli history.
He attacked the new government relentlessly. He called them illegitimate. He said they were stealing the election from the right-wing majority. He organized protests. He appeared on TV constantly.
He used social media effectively. His message was simple: this government is a disaster.
They're weak on security. Weak on Iran.
They're betraying Israel's values. We need to bring them down. And slowly, methodically, he worked to destabilize the coalition.
The Bennett-Lapid coalition was always fragile.
It included parties with completely opposite ideologies. The only thing holding them together was opposition to Netanyahu.
But that wasn't enough.
Within a year, tensions were mounting.
Small parties started threatening to leave. The coalition's parliamentary majority eroded.
And then came a new wave of violence.
Terror attacks in Israeli cities. Tensions in Jerusalem. Military operations in Gaza and the West Bank.
The coalition struggled to respond coherently.
Different parties wanted different approaches. Unity crumbled. In June 2022, the coalition collapsed. New elections were called. Netanyahu saw his opportunity. The election campaign was bitter.
Netanyahu promised a return to strong leadership.
His opponents warned of authoritarianism.
Netanyahu made alliances with far-right parties.
Parties that were previously considered extreme. His critics were horrified. But Netanyahu's calculation was simple: he needed a majority. Whatever it took. On November 1, 2022, Israelis voted. And Netanyahu won decisively.
His coalition secured 64 seats in the 120-seat Knesset.
A solid majority.
At 73 years old, Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister for the sixth time.
He had done the impossible. He had returned from political death. Again. Netanyahu's new government was the most right-wing in Israeli history. It included ultra-religious parties and ultra-nationalist parties. They immediately pushed controversial policies, expanding settlements dramatically, reducing Supreme Court powers, changing the balance between religion and state, taking a harder line on Palestinians, and most controversially, judicial reform. Netanyahu's government proposed sweeping changes to Israel's judicial system. They wanted to limit the Supreme Court's ability to overturn laws. They wanted politicians to have more control over judicial appointments. Netanyahu said this was necessary. The courts have too much power, he argued. They're not elected. They shouldn't be able to override the people's will. But hundreds of thousands of Israelis disagreed. They saw this as an attack on democracy, an attempt to weaken checks and balances. Every Saturday, massive protests erupted. In Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, Israelis from all walks of life took to the streets. Democracy, they chanted. We won't let you destroy the country. The protests were unprecedented, bigger than anything in Israeli history. They went on for months. Even military reservists threatened to stop volunteering. Tech workers warned they'd leave the country. Business leaders expressed concern. Israel was tearing itself apart. Netanyahu tried to push forward anyway. But the pressure was immense. The country was on the brink. And then, on October 7, 2023, everything changed. October 7, 2023. A Saturday morning. Simchat Torah, a Jewish holiday. At 6:30 a.m., sirens sounded across southern Israel. Not unusual. Rocket attacks from Gaza happened periodically. But this was different. Thousands of Hamas terrorists breached the border fence. They poured into Israeli communities. They went house to house, killing everyone they found. Entire families were murdered in their homes. Young people at a music festival were massacred. Hostages were dragged back to Gaza. By the end of the day, over 1,200 Israelis were dead. More than 240 were taken hostage. It was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Israel was in shock. Absolute shock. How had this happened? How had thousands of terrorists breached the border without warning? Where was the army? Where was the intelligence? For Benjamin Netanyahu, this was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. He was Prime Minister. He was Mr. Security. He had built his entire career on keeping Israelis safe. And now, on his watch, the worst terrorist attack in Israeli history had occurred. The public was outraged. Families of victims blamed him. Military experts questioned him. His political opponents attacked him. You were so busy with judicial reform, you took your eye off security, they accused. You weakened the military. You ignored warnings. You were complacent. Netanyahu's response was subdued. He accepted overall responsibility but didn't resign. He said Israel needed stable leadership during wartime. But everyone knew his legacy was in ruins. His reputation as a security expert was shattered. Israel's response was swift and massive. The military launched a full-scale operation in Gaza. The goal: destroy Hamas. Rescue the hostages. Ensure October 7th never happens again. But the operation was brutal. Gaza was devastated. Thousands of Palestinian civilians died. The humanitarian crisis was severe. International condemnation poured in. Protests erupted worldwide. Israel was accused of war crimes, of genocide, of disproportionate force. Netanyahu's government pushed forward anyway. "We have no choice," they said. "Hamas must be eliminated." The war dragged on. Weeks became months. The hostages remained in captivity. The death toll mounted. And Netanyahu faced a dilemma: if he ended the war too soon, Hamas would survive and claim victory. But if he continued, the humanitarian cost and international isolation would grow. He was trapped. Even during the war, Netanyahu's political survival instincts were active. He knew that when the war ended, there would be a reckoning. Investigations, inquiries, demands for accountability. He would likely be blamed, possibly forced to resign. So he did what he always did: he fought for survival. He kept the coalition together. He delayed difficult decisions. He managed the narrative as best he could. His critics accused him of prolonging the war for political reasons, of sacrificing soldiers and hostages to stay in power. Netanyahu denied this vehemently. "I'm doing what's necessary for Israel's security," he insisted. But the accusation stuck. Even some of his supporters began to doubt. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this period was the hostage families. Families whose loved ones were kidnapped to Gaza, held in tunnels, tortured, some killed. These families became a powerful political force. They demanded action. They demanded their loved ones back. They accused Netanyahu of not doing enough. Some hostages were rescued. Some were freed in negotiations. But many remained captive. And some were found dead. The family's pain was visible. Their anger was real. And it was directed at Netanyahu. At public events, family members would confront him. "Bring them home," they'd shout. "Why are you failing them?" Netanyahu had no good answers. He promised he was doing everything possible. But the families didn't believe him. For a man who had built his career on being strong, being seen as helpless was devastating. As the war continued, Israel became increasingly isolated internationally. Countries recalled ambassadors. Universities divested. Corporations pulled out. Protests targeted Israeli businesses and citizens. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli officials. The UN condemned Israel repeatedly. Even traditional allies like the United States began to express concern. President Biden called for restraint. European leaders demanded a ceasefire. Netanyahu pushed back. "The world doesn't understand what we're facing," he said. "They judge us from comfortable distance. We're fighting for survival." But the isolation was real. And it was damaging Israel's standing in the world. As Netanyahu navigated this crisis, a bigger question loomed: what would his legacy be? For years, he had been the dominant figure in Israeli politics. The longest-serving prime minister. The man who shaped modern Israel. But now, his legacy was complicated. Very complicated. The achievements were real. He kept Israel secure for most of his tenure. He presided over economic prosperity. He achieved the Abraham Accords. He stood up to Iran. He made Israel a technological powerhouse. But the failures were also real. October 7 happened on his watch. He deepened internal divisions. He was accused of corruption. He couldn't achieve lasting peace. He left Israel more isolated internationally. How would history judge him? Benjamin Netanyahu is a paradox. He is both Israel's most successful politician and one of its most divisive figures. He is loved intensely by millions and hated intensely by millions more. He is credited with keeping Israel safe and blamed for its greatest security failure. He is seen as a brilliant strategist and as a cynical political operator. How do we make sense of this man? Perhaps the best word to describe Netanyahu is survivor.
From his childhood in the shadow of history, through military service, through political defeats, through scandals and investigations, through wars and protests, he has always survived.
When others would have quit, he persevered.
When others would have compromised, he held firm. When others would have accepted defeat, he found a way back. This survival instinct is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It kept him in power. But it also made him seem more concerned with power than with purpose.
Netanyahu is often accused of having no real ideology, of being purely transactional, of caring only about staying in power. But this isn't entirely fair.
Netanyahu does have a worldview. It's been remarkably consistent throughout his career.
First, strength is essential. In a dangerous neighborhood, weakness invites attack. Israel must always be strong enough to deter its enemies. Second, trust is dangerous.
Agreements are only as good as the other side's ability and willingness to enforce them.
Israel cannot rely on international guarantees or Palestinian promises. Third, Jewish survival is paramount. After centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust, Jews need their own state to survive. Israel's existence is non-negotiable. Fourth, time is on Israel's side.
If Israel can stay strong long enough, its enemies will eventually accept its existence. Peace will come through strength, not through concessions. This worldview explains almost everything Netanyahu has done.
It's not about power for power's sake. It's about implementing a specific vision of how Israel survives.
You can disagree with this vision.
Many do. But it's a genuine ideology, not just cynical politics. Netanyahu once said, "Leadership is a lonely job.
You make decisions that affect millions of lives.
And whatever you decide, half the country will hate you for it."
This was certainly true for him. Every decision he made created enemies.
Support settlements? The left hates you. Negotiate with Palestinians? The right hates you. Continue a war? Families of soldiers hate you. End a war? Families of victims hate you. There was no way to make everyone happy. So Netanyahu stopped trying. He made the decisions he thought were necessary and accepted the hatred that came with them. This gave him a reputation for coldness, for lacking empathy, for being ruthless. But perhaps it was just the armor he needed to survive in one of the world's most difficult political environments. Throughout all of this, Netanyahu's family played a complex role.
His wife, Sarah, was controversial. She was accused of being difficult,
of interfering in government affairs, of spending excessively. The media regularly attacked her.
The public had strong opinions about her. She became almost as polarizing as her husband. His sons, Yair and Avner, also became public figures.
Yair especially was vocal on social media, defending his father and attacking critics.
Some saw this as loyalty.
Others saw it as entitlement. But for Netanyahu, family was everything.
After losing his brother Yonatan, he understood that political power was temporary but family was forever.
Netanyahu's ongoing corruption trial hangs over everything. He stands accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust.
Serious charges that could result in prison time. He maintains his innocence.
He says the charges are politically motivated, that the justice system is biased, that he's being persecuted. His supporters believe him. They see him as a victim of a left-wing conspiracy. His opponents say he's guilty and should resign. The truth? The trial is still ongoing. No verdict has been reached. But the very fact that a sitting prime minister is on trial is extraordinary. It speaks to both the strength of Israeli democracy, no one is above the law, and its dysfunction, the leader of the country can't fully focus on governing. Perhaps the biggest question about Netanyahu's legacy is, did he make peace possible or impossible? His critics say he killed the peace process. By expanding settlements, by refusing to negotiate seriously, by demonizing Palestinians, he made a two-state solution impossible. His supporters say he was realistic. Palestinians weren't ready for peace. Any concessions would have been exploited for attacks. He protected Israeli lives by refusing dangerous compromises. Both sides have evidence. But the fundamental question remains unanswered. Could there have been peace if Netanyahu had acted differently? Or was peace never really possible given the circumstances? We'll never know for certain. October 7, 2023 will forever be associated with Netanyahu. It happened on his watch. He was prime minister. He was responsible for security. And the security establishment failed catastrophically. Can he recover from this? Will history judge him primarily through the lens of this failure? Or will he be remembered for his decades of leadership, with October 7 being one chapter in a much longer story? Time will tell. But the shadow is long. Benjamin Netanyahu's story is not over. He's still in power. Still fighting. Still surviving. But we can already draw some conclusions about this remarkable, controversial, and complex man. Netanyahu was different from other Israeli leaders in several ways. He was more comfortable in English than Hebrew. More at home on American television than in Israeli politics. More focused on international perception than local sentiment. He brought American-style politics to Israel. The focus on media. The emphasis on personal branding. The constant campaigning. He understood power in ways others didn't. How to accumulate it. How to keep it. How to use it. He was patient. Willing to wait years for opportunities. Willing to take temporary defeats to achieve long-term victories. He was calculating. Every move was strategic. Every statement was planned. Nothing was spontaneous. These traits made him extraordinarily effective. But they also made him seem cold. Manipulative. Untrustworthy. The Israel that Netanyahu leaves behind is very different from the Israel he inherited. Economically stronger. A tech powerhouse. A startup nation. Diplomatically more connected. Peace with several Arab states. Strong ties with many countries. Militarily more advanced. A regional superpower with sophisticated capabilities. But also more divided internally. Deep splits between left and right, religious and secular, Jewish and Arab. More isolated internationally. Criticized by the UN, ICC, and many countries. Further from peace with Palestinians. Settlements expanded. Two-state solutions seemingly dead. More unequal. Economic gaps widened. Social tensions increased. Is this the Israel Netanyahu intended to build? Or are these the unintended consequences of his policies? Both, probably. For all his political success, Netanyahu paid a personal price. His reputation is permanently tarnished by corruption accusations. His legacy is complicated by October 7. His family life has been lived in public, subject to constant scrutiny and attack. He has few real friends. Many former allies have turned against him. He is surrounded by loyalists, but how many would stay if he lost power? He has spent decades in the arena, fighting constantly. It must be exhausting. Even for someone as driven as Netanyahu. Was it worth it? Only he can answer that question. How will history remember Benjamin Netanyahu? It depends on what happens next. If Israel survives and thrives, if the Abraham Accords lead to broader peace, if the economy continues to grow, if security is maintained,
he may be remembered as a great leader who steered the nation through difficult times. If Israel becomes increasingly isolated, if internal divisions deepen, if another security catastrophe occurs, if the corruption allegations stick, he may be remembered as a divisive figure who put his own survival above the nation's interests. Probably, history will judge him as both. Great leaders are rarely simple. Churchill was brilliant but also deeply flawed.
De Gaulle transformed France but was also authoritarian.
Begin made peace with Egypt but also launched controversial wars.
Netanyahu fits this pattern. A leader of immense capability and immense controversy. Benjamin Netanyahu once said, "The test of leadership is not whether you're liked. It's whether you kept your people safe and secured their future."
By this standard, his record is mixed.
He did keep Israel safe for most of his tenure. But October 7 was a catastrophic failure. He did help build Israel's economy and international standing.
But he also deepened divisions and failed to achieve lasting peace.
Perhaps the fairest assessment is this: Netanyahu was exactly what Israel needed at certain moments,
and exactly the wrong leader at others. He was the right person to stand up to Iran, to project strength,
to make the Abraham Accords.
But he was the wrong person to heal divisions,
to pursue peace,
to step aside when the moment called for new leadership.
What can we learn from Netanyahu's life? Perhaps this: power is seductive. Once you have it, it's very hard to let go.
Netanyahu has been prime minister for a total of 16 years across multiple terms.
He has dominated Israeli politics for 3 decades. At some point, every leader should ask, am I still serving my country, or is my country serving my ambition? Did Netanyahu ever ask himself this question? And if so, how did he answer? We don't know. But it's a question every leader must face. As of today, Benjamin Netanyahu is still prime minister. Still on trial. Still fighting for his political survival. The war in Gaza continues. The hostages remain captive. The protests continue.
The country remains divided.
How this story ends, we don't yet know. Will Netanyahu resign? Will he be forced out? Will he survive yet again? Will he be remembered as Israel's greatest prime minister or its most damaging? Will October 7th define his legacy? Or will it be just one chapter in a much larger story? These questions remain unanswered. But one thing is certain: Benjamin Netanyahu has shaped Israel in profound ways.
For better and for worse, he has left his mark on history.
And long after he's gone, Israelis will still be debating his legacy.
Still arguing about whether he was the leader they needed or the leader who led them astray. Because that's what happens with truly significant leaders.
They're never forgotten. And they're never fully understood. Benjamin Netanyahu is that kind of leader.
Love him or hate him, you cannot ignore him.
And perhaps that's exactly what he wanted all along.